There is a hush that falls over the world when the mind begins to wander. Not the wandering of aimless thought, but the quiet curiosity that seeks something deeper. In this hush, we find ourselves brushing against the edges of timeless ideas, thoughts that once stirred in candlelit rooms, whispered through parchment scrolls, or echoed beneath open skies. The greatest thinkers of all time did not always wear crowns or command armies. Many of them moved unnoticed through their cities, walking slowly, questioning gently, reflecting deeply. Their tools were not weapons or gold, but questions, observations, metaphors, and models of a better world. Some lived in ancient temples, others in modest homes or quiet studies, but each one, in their own way, helped shape the very way we understand life, its mysteries, its motions, its meanings. This is not a story of fame or conquest. It is a story of minds and the slow, careful steps they took through history. You're invited now to walk alongside them, not with urgency, but with peace. We will begin with the quiet origins of thought itself. So come, let's explore history together. Your love and support truly mean the world to me. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where are you listening from tonight? Grab your coffee and let's get started. In the heart of ancient Athens, the morning sun would rise slowly over the worn marble columns and soft dust of the agora. Merchants would open their stalls, the scent of olives and figs hanging gently in the air. But amidst the ordinary rhythm of the city, there walked a man with a face carved by time, his gaze always thoughtful, never hurried. This man asked questions not to win debates, but to unsettle comfort. His name was Socrates. He left behind no scrolls, no written doctrines. What we know of him floats gently through the voices of others, Plato, Xenophon, Aristophanes, but his presence was undeniable. There was something quiet yet persistent about him. He was not a scholar in the way others might expect. He claimed to know nothing, and yet through that confession, he opened a space for the deepest kind of knowledge. He wandered the city like a lantern searching for light, asking questions that tugged at the threads of belief. What is justice? What is courage? What is the good life? With these he dismantled pretensions gently, like someone wiping away dust to reveal what lies beneath. He often stood still for long periods, lost in thought. There's a quiet story told of Socrates freezing in contemplation during a military campaign, standing motionless for hours as the world passed by. He was not detached, not indifferent, but his mind wandered inward, not outward. He listened not only to others but to something deep inside, what he sometimes called his daimonion, an inner voice that offered no answers, only cautions. His method, now called the Socratic method, was simple, yet profoundly disarming. He would ask a question, wait, and then gently prod each answer with more questions, not to shame or expose, but to guide, to help others arrive at something truer than their first response. It was conversation as quiet excavation, peeling away assumptions until the mind stood bare and honest. To some, this made Socrates dangerous. In a society that prided itself on tradition and civic pride, his unrelenting curiosity felt like erosion. He questioned poets, craftsmen, generals, and even the gods. And all with the same humble persistence. I know that I know nothing, he said, but within that nothing was an openness, an invitation to learn again. He taught not in lecture halls but in courtyards, on dusty roads, and beneath the open sky. His disciples were not always formal students. Many were simply citizens who stopped to listen, some captivated, others irritated. Among them was a young man named Plato, whose writings would carry Socrates' legacy into future centuries. But not all were fond of this quiet man. Athens, bruised by war and unrest, began to fear that his influence unsettled too much. He was accused of corrupting the youth and disrespecting the gods. The trial that followed was not swift, but the verdict was guilty. Even then, Socrates did not resist. Offered a chance to escape, he refused. He would not run from the laws of the city, even if they condemned him. He accepted his fate, to drink a cup of hemlock, a slow-acting poison. Surrounded by friends, he spent his final moments in conversation, calmly discussing the soul and the afterlife, as if preparing for a long journey rather than an ending. There is something deeply stilling in this, the man who questioned death itself, meeting it with the same curious calm that had defined his life. In the centuries that followed, Socrates became a symbol, not of defiance, but of unwavering inquiry, a reminder that the mind, when opened gently, can become its own light. We often speak of wisdom as something loud, speeches, commands, declarations. But Socrates showed us a different kind of wisdom, one that whispers, one that waits, one that asks, is this really true? And if not, what might be? He didn't seek answers as trophies. He sought them as resting places, temporary shelters in a lifelong journey through thought. And in this journey, he left behind not pages, but presence, not laws, but questions. Questions that never slept and never will. The streets of Athens have changed. The voices have shifted. But still, somewhere in the rhythm of walking and wondering, the spirit of Socrates lives. In every sincere question, in every humble doubt, in every conversation that seeks truth gently, his footsteps echo. So as you rest tonight, let your mind soften into that same stillness. Let your thoughts drift gently toward the questions that matter most. Not for answers, not for certainty, but simply for the quiet courage of wondering. And in that wondering, peace. Stone walls, flickering shadows, a soft echo of chains moving across a cave floor. Plato began one of his most enduring teachings not with a lecture or argument, but with an image, one meant not to frighten, but to awaken. In his famous allegory of the cave, he invites us to picture ourselves as prisoners, bound since birth, facing a blank wall. Behind us, a fire burns, and between the fire and our backs, figures pass, casting moving shadows upon the wall in front of us. These shadows are all we know. To Plato, this image wasn't fantasy, it was philosophy. It was a quiet mirror held up to the human condition, to the way we live, often seeing only reflections of truth, mistaking illusions for reality. But he believed we could turn around, that we could loosen the chains of assumption, that slowly we could climb from darkness into a place where the light reveals things as they truly are. Plato's world was shaped deeply by Socrates, his teacher and quiet guide. He never forgot the humility of those questions, the way Socrates could dismantle certainty with just a gentle phrase. But where Socrates wandered the streets, Plato built a place of his own, the academy, a grove of trees and a circle of minds. It became one of the first true institutions of learning, not rigid, not formal, but living, breathing, growing. Here, under olive branches and evening skies, students gathered not to memorize but to wonder. They spoke of justice, of virtue, of the soul, and Plato, always listening, always sketching the contours of ideas, gave shape to a vision of philosophy that would echo across centuries. His writing took the form of dialogues, conversations between voices, usually anchored by Socrates, but rich with nuance and perspective. Each dialogue was like a slow stream, winding through thought, never rushing, never demanding. These weren't scripts for argument. They were quiet invitations to sit beside the thinker, to join the conversation, to wonder. One of Plato's central ideas was the theory of forms, or ideas as he often called them. According to him, everything in the physical world is a shadow, a reflection of a perfect, unseen form. A tree, for example, might bend and break, bloom and wither, but the form of a tree, its essence, remains unchanged and eternal. For Plato, reality wasn't built on what we see or touch. It was built on understanding, the kind that lives behind the senses. In the realm of pure thought, he believed that to truly know something, we had to go beyond appearances and remember what our souls already carried. Yes, remember. Because for Plato, learning was not about gathering new information, but recalling what the soul had forgotten. In this quiet, circular idea, he captured something profound, that wisdom isn't something chased, it's something uncovered. He wrote about love, not as a passing emotion, but as a force that draws the soul upward, toward beauty, toward truth, toward unity. His dialogue, the Symposium, weaves love not into passion or desire, but into transcendence, a gentle climb from the love of one body to the love of wisdom itself. And then there was the Republic, his most ambitious vision. Not a blueprint for political power, but a thought experiment for justice. In it he imagined a society led by philosopher kings, where each person performed the role most suited to their soul. It wasn't about control, it was about balance, harmony, a city where reason ruled not with a loud voice but a steady hand. Though much of Plato's world is distant now, its city's dust, its scrolls worn, his legacy remains like a quiet tide beneath the surface of our thinking. Every time we ask what is real, what is just, what is true, we touch the edges of his thought. Even in times of turmoil, Plato never turned away from the life of the mind. After Socrates' death, after wars and exiles, he continued to write, to teach, to guide. His life stretched long, and his thoughts stretched farther still. He died in his 80s, surrounded, it is said, by scrolls and silence. What remains most gentle about Plato is not the weight of his ideas, but the way he delivered them. Not with force, but with patience. Not with doctrine, but with image. The cave, the ladder of love, the divided line. These weren't diagrams of the world, but doorways into deeper reflection. We live in an age of speed and noise, but Plato's wisdom asks us to slow down, to turn gently like the prisoner in the cave, away from the shadows, to blink in the quiet light of something truer, and to sit with that light, not with urgency, but with peace. So tonight, as your thoughts begin to soften, you might imagine yourself in that ancient grove of the Academy, the air warm, the sky fading into dusk. Around you, slow voices move like wind through leaves, asking questions not to test but to explore. And somewhere nearby, Plato listens. He listens still. The olive groves of northern Greece whispered with the breeze, as a young boy named Aristotle walked slowly beneath their shade. Unlike Plato's soaring metaphors or Socrates' patient questions, Aristotle's mind moved differently, not upward toward the forms, but downward into the world. He watched insects with care. He studied leaves with attention. The world to him was not an illusion to escape from, but a rich living fabric to be gently understood. Born in the small city of Stagira, in 384 BCE, Aristotle was the son of a physician. Perhaps that's why his curiosity always leaned toward observation, structure, and the way things worked. His father died while Aristotle was still young, but the rhythm of careful study never left him. At 17, he made his way to Athens, where he joined Plato's academy, walking now in the very grove we imagined before. There, among the dialoguing minds, Aristotle listened. He studied for nearly 20 years under Plato, but over time, a gentle difference began to bloom. While Plato often looked beyond the visible world, Aristotle leaned into it. He wanted to know how things grew, moved, changed, and interacted. He believed that by observing nature patiently and precisely, we could arrive at truth just as surely as we could through abstract thought. After Plato's death, Aristotle left Athens. He traveled to Asia Minor, then to the island of Lesbos, where he immersed himself in the study of nature. The island's coastlines became his laboratory. He catalogued sea creatures, studied reproduction in animals, and described the shapes of shells and the movements of fish. His notebooks were filled with gentle observations, not just of structure, but of purpose. In time, he would return to Macedonia, where a new opportunity awaited him. He was asked to tutor a young prince. That prince would one day become Alexander the Great. But in those early years, Aristotle was simply a quiet teacher, guiding a restless boy with lessons on ethics, science, and politics. Eventually, Aristotle returned once more to Athens. But rather than rejoin the academy, he created his own place of learning, the Lyceum. It was different in tone and style, less mystical, more practical. Students here walked as they learned, strolling alongside their teacher. This is why they were called peripatetics, those who walk, and in that gentle pacing, Aristotle unfolded his vast understanding of the world. He wrote about nearly everything: biology, logic, poetry, politics, physics, and ethics. Each subject to him was a thread in a much larger tapestry, and he believed that everything in the world had both a form and a purpose, a final cause. The rain nourished the earth, the heart moved blood through the body. The acorn held within it the shape and destiny of the oak. His works do not often stir with metaphor or mysticism. They are careful, ordered, methodical, yet there is a deep serenity in that structure, a belief that the universe, though vast, can be understood if we approach it with patience and clarity. One of his most enduring ideas was the concept of the golden mean, the gentle balance between extremes. Courage, for example, lies between rashness and cowardice, generosity between wastefulness and stinginess. Virtue, he believed, was not a rigid rule, but a balance, a practice of moderation. Like tuning a stringed instrument, one must find the tension that produces harmony. In his Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle explored how one becomes good, not by sudden transformation, but through habit, repeated action, steady choices. He saw the good life, not as an escape from the world, but as a life of reason, virtue, and meaningful community. And in politics too, he searched for the best form of government, not in ideals alone but in how real people live together. He observed the strengths and weaknesses of monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy. He knew that people were not perfect, and so any system must bend gently to human nature. Though many of his scientific ideas would later be revised, his approach, careful observation, classification, and the search for causes, laid the foundation for centuries of learning. Even today, when we speak of biology, logic, or metaphysics, we are speaking in the soft language first shaped by Aristotle. He passed away in 322 BCE, in the quiet town of Chalcis. Exiled once more from Athens, he left behind no school in his name, no monument, just writings, many of them lecture notes, unfinished fragments, careful lists of terms and descriptions. But in their quiet accumulation, a mind reveals itself, steady, thoughtful, devoted. What makes Aristotle's thinking so deeply soothing is not its grandness but its order. In a world that often feels fragmented, his vision offers gentle cohesion. Each thing has a place, each cause has a reason, and through thoughtful attention, we might come to rest in the knowledge that life, even in its complexity, holds meaning. So tonight, if your thoughts wander toward chaos, toward unfinished tasks or unanswered questions, let Aristotle's voice come quietly. Let it whisper of balance, of observation, of calm understanding. Let it remind you that to live wisely is not to know everything, but to listen deeply to the world as it is, and to trust that, through patient thought and gentle practice, wisdom will come, softly and in time. The sound of bamboo leaves brushing softly against the wind, the faint rhythm of footsteps across stone, and in the center of it all, a man walking slowly through the villages of ancient China, dressed in plain robes, carrying no sword, no seal of office, only his thoughts, his words, and the hope of restoring harmony to a world adrift. His name was Confuzi, or as the world would come to know him, Confucius. Born in 551 BCE, in the state of Lu, a region in what is now eastern China, Confucius entered a world filled with disorder. The Zhou dynasty's central authority was unraveling, and the once stable society had fractured into competing states. Wars flared, tradition faded, families and communities grew uncertain of their place and purpose. And into this quiet turmoil, Confucius was born, not into nobility, but into modest means. His father, once a soldier, died early, and the boy was raised by his mother with great care and discipline. From a young age, Confucius was drawn to the Li, the rituals, manners, and customs that once ordered society with dignity and peace. But to him, these were not empty performances. They were echoes of a time when people knew how to live in balance with one another, with their ancestors, and with the world. He believed that society could heal, not through force, but through virtue. That if rulers were just, if children honored their parents, if friends treated one another with loyalty, and if words were spoken with honesty, then the chaos might subside. The path forward was not new, he said. It was a return, not to nostalgia, but to the way, a deep living order beneath all things. Confucius did not see wisdom as brilliance or conquest. He saw it in the humble daily acts of respect, in the way a son bows to his father, in the sincerity of a handshake, in silence when speaking would do harm. And at the center of all his teachings was the human heart, the capacity for ren, or benevolence, a kind of compassionate awareness that binds people together. He taught that every person, from the ruler to the farmer, had a role in society, a place not defined by status but by responsibility. He longed to serve in government, not to wield power, but to bring moral order to the court. He traveled from state to state, offering his counsel, speaking with rulers, sharing his vision. Yet again and again, he was turned away. Too idealistic, they said, too focused on virtue in an age of ambition. But he did not grow bitter, he walked on. For many years, he wandered with a small group of disciples, young men who listened, asked, learned. Around fires and under trees, they discussed everything from the duties of rulers to the power of poetry. And it was through these disciples that his words would live on, carefully recorded in what would later be called the Analects. His teachings are simple at first glance, but deep when dwelled upon. Isn't it a joy to study and practice what you have learned? Do not do to others what you would not wish done to yourself. When you see a worthy person, think of becoming like them. When you see an unworthy person, examine yourself. There's no dogma here, no forceful command, just gentle reminders, soft steps toward a life of dignity, humility, and reflection. One of his most cherished principles was filial piety, respect for parents and ancestors, not out of blind obedience, but out of deep connection. For Confucius, the family was the root of all society. If the family was strong in virtue, the community would be strong, and if the community was strong, so too would be the state. He believed in change, but not revolution. His path was one of restoration, of mending, not breaking. He spoke of 5 core relationships between ruler and subject, parent and child, husband and wife, elder and younger siblings, and friend to friend. Each to him had its own rhythm, its own duties. Not all were equal in power, but all required mutual care, and it was in fulfilling these relationships with sincerity that one walked the path of the wise. Though he never achieved political power, his quiet influence grew. After his death, his followers continued to carry his teachings across China, and centuries later, dynasties would adopt Confucianism as a central philosophy, not only for governance but for life itself. His vision of ordered society, grounded in virtue and respect, became the very fabric of Chinese civilization for over 2,000 years. What's most calming about Confucius isn't simply what he taught, but how he saw the world, not as a place to conquer but as a living harmony to be tuned, like a zither or a poem. Every gesture, every word, carried the potential to either disturb or restore that harmony, and so he urged us to move through life with intention. Even today, in moments of stillness, his presence remains. In the way we pause before speaking, in the way we bow our heads in gratitude, in the silent respect between generations, he is there, not as a distant figure, but as a gentle voice, reminding us that peace begins not in grand speeches, but in daily grace. So tonight, as your body settles and your breath softens, let Confucius walk beside you, not with lessons or rules, but with presence. Let his wisdom seep into your rhythm, into your conversations, into your silences, and trust, as he did, that a kind life, however small, can echo gently through generations. The morning sea mist rolled slowly through the streets of Alexandria, brushing the marble steps and softening the edges of statues. Ships rested quietly in the harbor, their sails curled like folded wings. Somewhere, through the echo of sandals on stone, the doors of a lecture hall opened, and within it stood a woman, cloaked in white linen, her voice steady, her eyes alert, her mind alight with ancient light. Her name was Hypatia. She lived in the twilight of the classical world, sometime between 350 and 370 CE, though the exact date of her birth is unclear, like much of her life wrapped in soft historical haze. But one thing is certain, in a time when women were rarely welcomed into public thought, Hypatia not only stepped into the world of ideas, she became one of its brightest stars. She was the daughter of Theon, a mathematician and astronomer who taught at the famed Library of Alexandria. Under his guidance, she learned not just equations and stars, but the steady discipline of logic, the elegance of geometry, and the quiet power of observation. Her brilliance was not loud, it was calm, precise, and deeply rooted. Alexandria, in those days, was still a city of wonders. The great library, even if diminished from its prime, still housed scrolls from across civilizations. Its classrooms were spaces of layered language, where Greek thought met Egyptian tradition, and where philosophy breathed alongside astronomy and mathematics. It was within this layered world that Hypatia taught. She took no husband. She wore the scholar's robes, a symbol of her commitment to the life of the mind. Her lectures drew crowds not merely because of her rarity as a woman philosopher, but because of the clarity with which she spoke. She taught the works of Plato and Aristotle, refined mathematical principles, and explained the paths of the stars above with calm precision. She is remembered as the last great voice of the Alexandrian philosophical tradition, a keeper of the Neoplatonist flame. In this worldview, reality moved in concentric rings, from the material to the spiritual, all things seeking to return to a divine unity. To study geometry was to understand the shape of the soul. To trace the stars was to glimpse the structure of the cosmos. Knowledge was not divided, it was a ladder, and each discipline was a rung upward. Hypatia moved between these disciplines with elegance. She is believed to have written commentaries on Diophantus, improved upon Ptolemy's astronomical models, and constructed astrolabes and hydrometers, not as trophies of innovation, but as tools for understanding. Her hands moved through metal, ink, parchment, and sky with equal care. But beyond her intellectual grace, there was something even more fragile in her story, something that echoes in the spaces between facts. She lived at a time of deep transition. The Roman Empire was changing. Christianity, once persecuted, had become powerful. Tensions brewed between old philosophies and new authorities. Hypatia, though respected, lived between those tensions. Her home, Alexandria, became a battleground of belief. Religious factions fought not only over dogma, but over direction. What should a city value? What should it remember? And what or who should it silence? Hypatia never attacked any faith. She welcomed students of all backgrounds, Christians, pagans, skeptics. Her teachings focused on logic, ethics, and the celestial, but her prominence, her independence, and her refusal to bow to political tides made her vulnerable. In the eyes of some, she became a symbol not of wisdom but of resistance. In the year 415 CE, during a time of violent upheaval, a group of zealots dragged Hypatia from her carriage. The details of her death are painful and often repeated. But here, in this quiet retelling, we need not linger in that darkness. Let us instead hold to what came before, the peace of her lecture hall, the glide of a stylus across parchment, the hush that fell when she lifted her hand to trace a theorem in the air. For centuries after, her name would be spoken in hushed reverence, as a martyr for reason, as a symbol of intellectual courage, as a reminder of what can be lost when fear overtakes thought. She became a soft emblem, not just of feminism or philosophy, but of integrity, of choosing truth, even in silence. No complete works of Hypatia survive. Her writings are gone, perhaps burned, perhaps buried in forgotten corners of time, but what remains is her imprint. Through the accounts of others, we glimpse her presence, a woman standing at the edge of two worlds, holding a lamp of reason as the winds of history howled around her. And though the lamp was eventually extinguished, its light found other hands, in other times. For knowledge does not die. It rests. It waits. So as you lay still tonight, as your thoughts begin to drift, imagine the quiet hum of Alexandria at dusk, the sea brushing softly against the harbor stones, the dome of the sky deepening into stars, and in a marble room near the heart of the city, a figure moves through diagrams and constellations, her voice calm, her mind vast, her soul gently aglow with thought. Hypatia, scholar, teacher, witness, flame, somewhere beyond the desert's breath, where the wind moves like silk across stone, and the stars draw quiet lines across the night. A young boy sat by a flickering oil lamp, not sleeping, not speaking, just turning pages. His name was Ibn Sina, but the world would come to know him as Avicenna. Born in the year 980 CE, near Bukhara, in what is now Uzbekistan, Avicenna grew up in a land rich with libraries and trade, a crossroads of cultures, knowledge, and philosophy. His father worked as a local governor, and from an early age the boy was immersed in study, not playfully, but with a kind of inward fire. By the time he was 10, he had memorized the Quran. By 16, he was treating patients, and by 18, he had mastered nearly every known branch of science, medicine, and logic available to him. But there was nothing loud about Avicenna's brilliance. He moved through the world with focused quietude. He read not to impress, but to understand. He said that after struggling with certain problems, he would pray, sleep, and often awake with the solution fully formed in his mind, as if wisdom arrived on the wings of dreams. He became a physician not through apprenticeship, but through deep intuition. He learned how the body mirrored the soul, how the organs sang in rhythms, and how thought could ease suffering as much as herbs or incantations. When the local Emir fell gravely ill and none could cure him, the young Avicenna was called. His treatment worked, and in return, he was granted access to the royal library, a vast ocean of forgotten scrolls and ancient wisdom. It was here that his genius flowered fully. He didn't just absorb information, he synthesized it. Where others saw fragments, he saw systems. And so he began to write, not in haste, but with the slow confidence of someone building a bridge between centuries. His most famous work, the Canon of Medicine, Al-Qanun fi al-Tibb, became a cornerstone of both Eastern and Western medical education for over 600 years. It was not merely a list of treatments, it was a philosophy of health, integrating Greek, Persian, Indian, and Islamic knowledge into a single, ordered framework. He wrote of fevers, of the pulse, of the eye's anatomy. But he also wrote of balance between humors, emotions, and elemental forces. To heal a body, he believed one must first understand the harmony that governs all living things. But medicine was only one melody in his vast symphony of thought. Avicenna also wrote deeply on metaphysics, asking what it means to exist and how the soul touches the eternal. His concept of the necessary existent, a being whose existence is essential, would echo across time, shaping the philosophies of both Muslim and Christian theologians. He saw the world as layered, from the material to the intelligible, from the physical to the spiritual. The human being stood at the center, a creature of both clay and spirit. Thought, for him, was not just an act of the brain, but a movement of the soul toward its source. Among his most delicate contributions was the thought experiment known as the floating man. Imagine, he wrote, a person created fully grown, suspended in air, with no sensory input, no sight, no sound, no touch. Would this person be aware of themselves? He argued yes. Even without the world, one would still know that they are. This, he said, was proof of the soul's independence, a quiet, inner light that shines even in isolation. He did not live a life of comfort. Political upheaval forced him to move often, writing in borrowed rooms, teaching under candlelight, sometimes imprisoned, sometimes welcomed, but he carried his books with him always, as if they were not objects, but companions. It's said that he wrote over 450 works, though only about 240 survive. Some are brief notes. Others, like the Book of Healing, span volumes. He wrote of logic, astronomy, psychology, ethics, and even music, and always his tone remained steady, never boastful, never harsh. He believed that philosophy was not reserved for scholars, but for all who seek wisdom, that the stars in the sky and the pulse beneath the wrist both speak the same language, if we listen closely. When he died in 1037, at the age of 57, he was buried near Hamadan in modern-day Iran. His grave rests beneath quiet earth, but his legacy moves still, through libraries, through whispered verses of Persian poetry, and through the careful hands of physicians and thinkers who followed in his path. Avicenna's mind was not a flame, quickly lit and quickly extinguished. It was more like the desert moon, constant, reflective, full of silent gravity. His thoughts moved like water across stone, reshaping what they touched but never shouting. And as we rest tonight, his presence still surrounds us, in the balance of breath, in the slow healing of time, in the quiet longing of the soul to understand itself. He reminds us that intellect need not be severe, that wisdom may come in dreams, and that sometimes the deepest truths are found not in what we know, but in the gentleness with which we seek. In the narrow alleys of medieval Córdoba, where golden light filtered through lattice windows and the distant hum of markets softened the sound of footsteps, a young boy named Moses ben Maimon walked among scrolls, scholars, and the scent of ink. The year was around 1135, and in this quiet city of Al-Andalus, where Muslims, Christians, and Jews shared uneasy space, a voice was forming that would echo gently through the centuries. He would come to be known as Maimonides, and in Hebrew, simply Rambam. From his earliest years, Moses was immersed in knowledge, not only of Jewish law and scripture, but of Arabic science, philosophy, and the classical world. Córdoba, at the time, was one of the jewels of learning in Europe. Its libraries brimmed with translations of Greek thinkers into Arabic, and its courtyards carried the sound of quiet debates. Maimonides absorbed it all, the rhythms of Aristotle, the rigors of Talmud, the subtleties of logic. But his youth was not untouched by hardship. In 1148, Córdoba fell to the Almohads, a strict Muslim dynasty that demanded conversion or exile from the non-Muslims of the city. Maimonides' family, like many others, chose flight. For years they wandered, moving from place to place in search of safety, dignity, and a quiet place to study. Eventually they settled in Fustat, near Cairo, in Egypt. There, among the palm-shaded streets and quiet mosques, Maimonides began to rebuild his life, not through bitterness but through scholarship. His father died. His brother, who supported the family through trade, was lost at sea, and so Maimonides turned to medicine, not just as a means of livelihood, but as a continuation of his quest to heal the soul through the body. He became a physician of great skill, eventually serving as court doctor to the Sultan. His days were long, attending to the ill and the powerful alike, and his nights even longer, spent writing by candlelight. Yet through all this, his tone remained calm, his purpose clear, to create a bridge between faith and reason. That bridge would take form in his Guide for the Perplexed, a philosophical text written in Arabic but using Hebrew script. It was not a book for casual reading. It was a gentle unraveling of confusion meant for those who struggled to reconcile deep faith with the apparent contradictions of rational thought. In it, Maimonides delicately addressed questions that still echo today. Can we describe God? Is human reason trustworthy? How should sacred texts be read when they seem at odds with science or logic? His answer, always delivered with softness and care, was that truth cannot contradict truth. If a scripture seemed to conflict with reason, then perhaps it was metaphor. If logic failed to explain the soul, then perhaps there was more to the soul than logic could hold. He urged the reader not to abandon faith, nor to reject reason, but to move slowly, step by thoughtful step toward a higher synthesis. He believed that God was beyond human comprehension, and that the greatest reverence was found not in certainty, but in silence, that the truest name for the divine was unspoken, that the wise do not claim, they seek, and in that seeking, they grow humble. Maimonides also wrote the Mishnah Torah, a codification of Jewish law, unlike any that had come before, with clarity and structure. He distilled complex legal discussions into a precise and accessible format. Some loved it. Others found it too bold, too streamlined, but none could deny its brilliance. It remains, to this day, a cornerstone of Jewish legal literature. Yet beyond law and philosophy, there was something more subtle in his legacy, a tone, a posture, a way of thinking. He believed that living well was a kind of medicine, that moderation was not weakness but wisdom. He advised, do not swing between extremes, walk the middle path. Let reason guide your emotion, and let the heart temper the intellect. He saw the human being as both noble and limited, capable of reason, wonder, and holiness, yet always shaped by environment, emotion, and need. To grow was to refine these forces, to polish the soul like a mirror until it could reflect the quiet light of the divine. In the evening, he would return from his duties tired but serene, and sit down to respond to letters from across the Jewish world. His replies were thoughtful, personal, and filled with gentleness. A community struggling with a question, a student wrestling with faith, he answered all with respect, never dismissing, always guiding. He passed away in 1004, and the place of his burial is still whispered over. Some say in Tiberias, in the Galilee. Others suggest elsewhere. But wherever his body rests, his influence remains woven into the quiet fabric of thought. What makes Maimonides so calming is not only what he knew but how he shared it. He did not shout his wisdom. He didn't claim to solve every mystery. Instead, he offered the listener a candle, a path, and the assurance that it is okay to not know, to be perplexed, and to keep walking anyway. So tonight, as your thoughts rise and fall like tides, let Maimonides speak softly across the centuries. Let him remind you that faith and intellect need not wrestle, that questions are not signs of failure, but of spiritual courage, and that sometimes the clearest answers are the ones that leave space for silence. The candlelight flickered against heavy stone walls. Beyond the narrow window, the plains of Italy stretched in stillness, hushed beneath the soft breath of evening winds. Inside a quiet cell at the monastery of Monte Cassino, a boy sat in silence, his hands resting on a scroll, his gaze distant but steady, as though listening for something deeper than words. This was Thomas Aquinas, born around 1225, near the town of Roccasecca. The youngest son of a noble family, Thomas was destined, as most youngest sons were, for the church. But even early in life, his temperament set him apart. He was large and slow-moving, thoughtful and quiet. While other boys chattered and debated, Thomas preferred stillness. He didn't speak often, and when he did, his words were measured, weighty, and clear. His classmates called him the dumb ox. But one of his teachers, the philosopher Albertus Magnus, smiled gently and said, "This ox will one day fill the world with his bellow." And so he did, though not with noise or force. Thomas's voice, like the man himself, was calm, deliberate, and grounded. His bellow was not thunder, but light, a quiet unfolding of reason, designed to hold faith with dignity. He joined the Dominicans, a new order of friars, who wandered barefoot from town to town, preaching, studying, and serving. His family, wanting a more prestigious future for him, opposed this choice. They tried to confine him, even locking him in a tower. But Thomas remained unmoved, not defiant, just still. He spent that time studying, praying, waiting, and eventually they let him go. He traveled to Paris, Cologne, and back again, always learning, always writing. His mind was vast, not in complexity, but in clarity. He read Aristotle not as a challenge to Christianity, but as a companion. He believed reason, and revelation were not rivals, they were partners. One illuminated what the other sanctified. This belief became the heart of his life's work. The Summa Theologica, a careful, structured attempt to explain the full architecture of Christian thought. It was not written to impress, but to serve, to help students, clergy, and thinkers understand the depth of their faith without fear of reason. Each question began gently, with an objection. Then came the counterpoint. Then softly, Thomas would write, "I answer that," and what followed was never sharp, never rushed. Just clarity, gentle scaffolding, built one thoughtful step at a time. In the summer, he wrote of God, of the soul, of creation and ethics. He discussed angels with the same seriousness as natural law. For Thomas, all of creation from stars to soil bore the fingerprint of its maker. To study the world was not to stray from God, but to walk toward him. One of his most tender ideas was that of natural law. The notion that every creature seeks its own good, that the universe has a moral order written into its very fabric. Water flows downward. Seeds reach for the sun. The human heart reaches for justice. He saw reason as a divine gift, a light placed within the mind to guide it toward what is true. But he also believed that reason had limits. At the horizon of understanding, where human intellect failed, there waited mystery, not as a void, but as a sacred silence. Near the end of his life, something changed. While celebrating Mass in 1273, Thomas had a vision, its details never fully recorded. From that day forward, he stopped writing. He turned to his assistant and said, "Everything I have written is straw compared to what I have seen," and he never wrote again. What happened remains unknown. But perhaps it wasn't an abandonment of knowledge, but a final realization that the greatest truths are not captured in words, but experienced in stillness. That beyond the structure of theology lies something even more sacred, presence. He died a few months later, in 1224, on his way to the Second Council of Leon. He was only 49 years old. His body was buried in the quiet shadows of the church. His books remained precise, careful, and luminous. In time, the church would name him Dr. Angelicus, the angelic doctor, a thinker who bridged reason and faith, philosophy and doctrine. His influence would shape centuries of theology, law, and ethics, and beyond his intellectual legacy, his spirit lingers in the tone of his words, not fiery, not triumphant, but composed, gentle, and deeply grounded. What makes Thomas Aquinas so calming is not just what he taught, but how he lived, never hurried, never combative. He trusted that truth does not need to be defended with sharp edges. It only needs light, patience, and a willing mind. So tonight, as you lie still, let the rhythm of Thomas's thought soothe you. Let the questions drift through your mind, like quiet prayers. What is good? What is true? What is just? Not to be answered quickly, but to be carried softly, like candles in the dark. And remember, at the edges of what we know, it is not fear that waits, but wonder. In the soft hills of Tuscany, where olive trees whisper and morning light falls like silk over stone, a boy wandered through fields with wide eyes and quiet footsteps. Birds in mid-flight, water rippling against rocks, the curve of a leaf, nothing escaped his gaze. He was not hurrying toward answers, only following questions. His name was Leonardo, born in 1452 in the small village of Vinci, an illegitimate child, raised in neither wealth nor lineage, but in the care of nature, curiosity, and quiet wonder. From the beginning, Leonardo lived not through books or institutions, but through seeing. He watched, he drew, he wondered, he asked questions not only of people, but of the wind, of shadows, of veins in a leaf. His education came slowly. Letters, mathematics, basic Latin, but his true schooling took place under the sky and at the banks of rivers. In Florence, still golden with Renaissance fire, he entered as an apprentice in the workshop of Andrea del Verrocchio. There, among pigments and chisels, His hands learned skill. He painted, sculpted, designed. But even then his thoughts wandered further, to how light moved across skin, to how muscles flexed beneath fabric, to how clouds gathered before rain. He was not simply an artist. He was an observer of systems, human, mechanical, natural, a painter who studied anatomy with surgical precision, a scientist who composed in brushstrokes, a mind that held machines and angels in the same breath. Yet, Leonardo did not rush to share. He carried his thoughts like folded maps, tucked into notebooks, written in mirror script, sketched in margins, thousands of pages filled with diagrams, theories, quiet musings, pages that he never published, pages he seemed to write more for the act of understanding than for an audience. He believed deeply in experience. He who does not know how to draw does not know. For Leonardo, knowing required touch, sight, movement. He dissected cadavers in silence, watching the way sinews clung to bone. He engineered flying machines from the study of bats. He drew vortices and lungs, churches and gears, water wheels and wings. His notebooks reveal a mind not content with beauty alone. He wanted to know why the sky is blue, why the moon appears larger at the horizon, why laughter echoes differently indoors. And when he could not find answers, he returned to the question, patiently, gently. He once wrote, "The painter's mind must be like a mirror. It turns itself to every object it sees and becomes one with its image." Leonardo was in this sense not only a painter but a mirror to the world. He reflected it back, not as it was commonly understood, but as it truly was, with all its movement, imperfection, and quiet logic. Among his most famous works is The Last Supper, not merely a depiction of a biblical scene, but a delicate study of tension, betrayal, grief, and divine stillness. And of course there is the Mona Lisa, not grand in scale but infinite in gaze. Her smile is not an answer, but a question. Her silence a quiet echo of Leonardo's own. He moved often, from Florence to Milan, Rome to France, always carrying his notebooks, always observing. He worked for kings and scholars, drew fortresses and fountains, studied optics and flight, and yet much of what he imagined was never built, never performed. But that did not trouble him. His joy was in the seeing, the asking, the sketching. Though his mind was filled with invention, he was not driven by conquest. He saw war machines as a necessity, not a fascination. He wrote of peace and balance, of humanity's responsibility to the earth. He studied water, not just for its force, but for its grace. He called it the driving force of all nature. He grew old, slowly, his hair turning white, his notebooks thicker. In 1516 he was invited to France by King Francis I, who offered him a quiet manor near the royal court. There, surrounded by gardens and soft conversation, Leonardo passed his final years in peace. He died in 1519, and legend holds that the king held his hand as he passed. Whether true or not, the image lingers, the world's greatest observer, leaving gently like the final stroke of a brush on canvas. But Leonardo never truly vanished. His notebooks, long hidden, have surfaced over centuries, revealing layer upon layer of soft, brilliant thought. Not declarations but questions, not manifestos, but sketches. They remind us that genius does not shout, it listens. And what makes Leonardo so endlessly calming is not his mastery, but his wonder, his ability to pause, to watch, to stay with a question longer than most would dare. He once wrote, "Learn how to see, realize that everything connects to everything else." And that perhaps is his greatest gift. Not his paintings or machines, but his way of seeing the world as a whole, tender organism, not a puzzle to conquer, but a symphony to listen to. So tonight, as your breathing slows and your thoughts grow soft, let Leonardo walk beside you through gardens of invention, through cathedrals of curiosity. Let his gaze steady yours. Let his questions drift across your dreams. In the stillness of a Tuscan twilight, where the hills ripple like folded cloth and the sky deepens to indigo. A young boy tilted his head toward the stars. The night was quiet, but to him it was not empty. It was moving slowly, gently, as if the whole sky breathed. This boy was Galileo Galilei, born in 1564 in the city of Pisa. His life would unfold like a quiet revolution, not loud, not sharp, but steady, like the slow turning of a gear no one thought to question. His father was a musician and theorist, a man who understood harmony, not only in notes but in ideas. From him Galileo inherited a mind attuned to rhythm, not just in music but in nature, in motion, in truth. He first studied medicine, following the expectations of the time, but his heart was drawn elsewhere, to shapes, patterns and motion, to falling objects, swinging pendulums and the soft tug of unseen forces. He would later recall that it was the swinging of a chandelier in a cathedral that first stirred his curiosity. It swayed, he noticed, in perfect rhythm, slower when wider, faster when near. Yet each swing took the same time. From that observation came the seed of an idea, that nature moves not by chaos, but by elegant laws. Galileo became a professor in Padua, teaching mathematics, philosophy, and mechanics. His lectures were popular, not because he entertained, but because he made things clear. He invited students not to memorize, but to see, to test, to observe. He began to experiment, quietly, carefully, rolling balls down inclined planes, measuring the swing of pendulums, dropping weights from heights. He wanted to know not just what things did, but how and why. But it was the sky that called to him most gently. When he first heard of the spyglass, a device from the Netherlands that allowed distant objects to appear close, Galileo did not simply admire it. He rebuilt it, then he improved it, and one evening in 1609 he lifted his polished lens toward the heavens. What he saw changed everything. The moon, he found, was not smooth and perfect, but pocked with craters and ridges. The stars were more numerous than anyone had imagined. The Milky Way was not a misty band, but a sea of individual light. And then came Jupiter, not alone, but accompanied by 4 small moons, circling steadily. These were not fixed stars. They moved, they orbited, they suggested a universe more dynamic, more intricate than the old models had allowed. Galileo wrote down what he saw, not with boldness, but with wonder. His little book, Sidereus Nuncius, The Starry Messenger, was published in 1610, offering gentle but undeniable evidence that the universe was not centered on Earth alone. He did not seek controversy. He sought clarity. But even clarity can disrupt. In those days, the Ptolemaic model, a geocentric view of the cosmos, was not just science, but theology. The heavens were thought to be perfect, unchanging, centered around humanity. Galileo's observations, which supported Copernicus's earlier heliocentric theory, quietly displaced this comfort. He continued to write, to observe, to share. His letters were thoughtful, his tone mostly respectful, but his growing confidence in what the telescope revealed began to raise concern among those who felt the Earth should not move. In 1632, he published Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief World Systems, a book written as a discussion among 3 characters. Though framed as an open conversation, it gently, and at times sharply, favored the heliocentric model. For this Galileo was summoned by the Inquisition. They questioned him. They pressed him. In the end, he recanted, not his thoughts, but their publication. His trial did not silence his ideas, but it did restrain his voice. He was placed under house arrest for the rest of his life. And yet, even there, confined and aging, Galileo continued. He wrote of motion. He studied tides. He developed the early groundwork for what would later be called inertia and acceleration. He did not regret his search. He once said, "I do not feel obliged to believe that the same God who has endowed us with sense, reason, and intellect has intended us to forgo their use." He died in 1642, quietly at home, merely blind, but still inwardly seeing. His books would go on to inspire others. Newton would later say that he stood on Galileo's shoulders, and yet Galileo never asked to be a giant. He was content to observe. What makes Galileo's story so deeply restful is its pace. He did not run toward fame. He walked toward truth, slowly, patiently, listening to pendulums, watching the stars, drawing careful lines in notebooks under candlelight. He did not rebel to be provocative. He questioned because he loved what was real. His faith and science were not enemies. For Galileo, both began with awe. So tonight, as you lie under your own sky, however cloudy, however distant, think of that quiet man with his telescope, peering up, not in arrogance but in reverence, watching not just for knowledge, but for harmony. Let your thoughts drift like the moons of Jupiter, steady in their orbit. Let them settle softly among the stars that once astonished him. And know this: the universe is still turning, gently, silently, just as he saw. The morning mist clung to the window panes of a quiet room in the Dutch countryside. A fire crackled low. The scent of ink hung in the still air, and a solitary man sat at a wooden desk, not hurried, not restless, just thinking. No bells, no crowds, no great fanfare, only a mind, turning gently inward. This was René Descartes, born in 1596, in the small French town of La Haye, now known as La Haye Descartes, in his honor. From his earliest years he was drawn to stillness, not out of shyness, but out of habit. Even as a child he was often excused from morning lessons due to fragile health, and he would lie in bed, quietly reflecting, while the world outside moved on. But what may have seemed like weakness became his gift. In the silence, Descartes learned to listen, not just to the world, but to his own thoughts. His intellect, even then, was deliberate and precise. He questioned what others accepted. He asked not only what was true, but how one could be certain at all. As a young man, Descartes studied law and mathematics, then enlisted in the military, traveling across Europe, watching, learning. It was during these travels that a deep idea began to take shape within him, a desire not just to gather knowledge, but to rebuild it, brick by careful brick, upon foundations that could not be shaken. He believed that truth should begin at its quietest point, inside the mind. And so he set out on a journey not of geography, but of thought. In 1637, he published a modest work titled Discourse on the Method. It was written not in Latin, the language of scholars, but in French, a gentle invitation to all who wondered, to all who pondered in solitude. His method was simple: begin by doubting, let go of assumptions, remove all that is uncertain. What remains, that still, steady knowing, is where real understanding begins. From this process came one of the most famous reflections in Western philosophy: cogito, ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. These words were not meant to be dramatic. They were the soft echo of something foundational, a whisper from the soul. Even if everything else could be doubted, the senses, the world, even the body, the act of thinking itself could not be denied. If one is doubting, one is thinking, and if one is thinking, one exists. This simple truth, so gentle, so unshakable, became Descartes' cornerstone. From it, he carefully built upward. He used reason, geometry, and reflection to rebuild a sense of the self, of the world, and of God, all shaped with symmetry and logic. But Descartes was not only a philosopher. He was a mathematician of extraordinary calm. He invented Cartesian coordinates, the system of plotting points on a graph, a method that quietly unified algebra and geometry, creating a visual language for abstract thought. That grid, now so familiar, began as a way for him to bring clarity to complexity, to draw a bridge between the seen and the abstract. He believed the universe, like thought itself, could be measured, understood, traced. But he also believed the mind stood apart, distinct from the body, from matter. For Descartes, there were two realms, res extensa, the world of extension and physical things, and res cogitans, the world of thought, of the inner self. This distinction, known as Cartesian dualism, would shape centuries of discussion. It offered a gentle yet enduring question. What is the relationship between mind and body, between what we feel and what we are? He did not rush to answers. He moved with care, always returning to doubt, not as a barrier, but as a clearing, a place from which real insight could rise. His life remained quiet. He wrote letters, hundreds of them, to princes, scholars, and friends. His tone was patient, instructive, and soft. He encouraged others not to memorize his conclusions, but to engage in the process, to think for themselves, to doubt, to rebuild. In 1649, he accepted an invitation to Sweden, where Queen Christina, a young and curious monarch, requested his presence as a tutor. But the cold northern air and the demand to teach at early hours wore on his health. Within months, Descartes fell ill with pneumonia and passed away quietly, far from home at the age of 53. His body was buried, exhumed, and moved several times over the years. But his thoughts remained settled like fresh snow over centuries of ideas, offering a clean beginning for those who wish to start again. And what makes Descartes so calming, so gently enduring, is not his certainty, but his method. He showed that it's okay to doubt, to pause, to begin from nothing but one's breath and thought. He proved that stillness can be a form of discovery, that even in a world of confusion, there exists within us a place that is quiet, solid, and unshaken. So as you rest tonight, consider his gift, the space to question without fear, the invitation to reflect without haste, the reminder that your thoughts, wandering steady, gentle, are the very proof of your being. And in that knowing, there is peace. It was a quiet orchard in the English countryside, the grass soft, the trees casting long shadows, and the sky a calm, pale dome above. The air moved slowly, as though carrying a secret. Beneath one of those apple trees, a solitary young man sat in thought, not in distress, nor excitement, just the long, steady quiet of a mind preparing to see something clearly for the very first time. His name was Isaac Newton, born in 1642 in Woolsthorpe, a small village nestled in the Lincolnshire countryside. He was born prematurely, so small that no one expected him to survive. But he did, quietly, persistently, like a candle refusing to flicker out. And in time, that faint flame would illuminate the very structure of the universe. Newton's early life was shaped by silence. His father died before he was born. His mother remarried, and Isaac was sent away to live with grandparents. He was often alone, not neglected, but separate. In those empty spaces, he began to observe the turning of wheels, the flow of water, the way shadows shifted across the floor. The world was not loud to him. It was deeply patterned, and he watched it with careful reverence. At Cambridge, Newton studied mathematics and philosophy. But it was during the plague years of 1665-66, when the university closed and he returned to Woolsthorpe, that his most enduring thoughts began to take shape. Those quiet months, alone again in the countryside, became one of the most productive periods in scientific history. It was here, in stillness, that he asked, why do things fall? Why do planets not fly off into space? What holds the moon in its course? The answer came not as thunder, but as quiet realization, a whisper of unity across all things, that the same force that pulls an apple to the ground also binds the planets to their paths. He called it gravity, and with it he described the silent law that holds the stars, the sea, and the very body in gentle obedience. Newton's work culminated in his Philosophiae Naturalis Principia Mathematica, often known simply as the Principia, published in 1687. In it he outlined the laws of motion and universal gravitation. But more than facts, what he offered was a soft, sweeping order, a way to see the universe not as chaotic or mystical, but as comprehensible, whole, and quietly governed. His first law taught that objects at rest stay at rest, and those in motion continue in straight lines, unless disturbed. The second law revealed the relationship between force, mass, and acceleration, not shouted in symbols but whispered through balance. And his third law, the most poetic of all: for every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. These laws did not remove wonder. They deepened it. Newton saw in this harmony not the absence of God, but the fingerprint of the divine. He believed that studying the universe was a way of honoring its creator, not by prayer alone, but by attention. But Newton was not only a physicist. He was an alchemist, a theologian, a mathematician. He wrote about prophecy and optics, calculated orbits, and biblical chronology. He invented calculus independently of Leibniz, crafting a tool so elegant and quiet that it now underlies everything from engineering to economics. Yet Newton's personality remained intensely private. He avoided crowds, disliked confrontation, and often retreated into solitary work. He had few close friendships. He was not a figure of drama, but of inward force, calm on the surface, relentless beneath. In later years, he became master of the mint, overseeing the English currency with the same precision he brought to the cosmos. He combated counterfeiting, redesigned coinage, and treated even the smallest inconsistencies as problems to be resolved with care. He never married. He left no descendants. But his legacy poured outward into science, into thought, into the very language of the physical world. His equations became like lullabies of logic, gently guiding minds through the mysteries of weight, distance, and time. And what makes Newton so soothing, even now, is not only the depth of his knowledge, but the stillness of his insight. He looked into the sky and saw not chaos, but choreography. He revealed that what falls and what orbits obeys the same law, that from apples to galaxies there is one rhythm, patient, precise, and always present. He once wrote, "I do not know what I may appear to the world, but to myself I seem to have been only like a boy playing on the seashore, finding a smoother pebble or a prettier shell, whilst the great ocean of truth lay all undiscovered before me." So tonight, as your thoughts quiet and your breathing slows, let that image guide you. A boy on the shore of the infinite, not rushing, not demanding, only picking up one smooth truth at a time. And know this: beneath your own world of questions and noise, the laws still hold, soft, constant, invisible. You do not need to grasp them all tonight, only to rest in the knowing that the stars above and the body you inhabit are held by the same unseen kindness, and that is enough. In the golden light of 18th century Paris, beneath domed ceilings and candlelit salons, there moved a man with quick eyes and sharper thoughts. His laughter was soft, but it carried weight. His pen, dipped in ink and reason, drew lines that would reach beyond kings, beyond borders, into the very heart of what it meant to think freely. He was born François-Marie Arouet in 1694, but the world would come to know him as Voltaire. The name itself had rhythm, brevity. Like the man, it spoke of invention, of deliberate transformation. He had shaped not only his words, but his self. From the beginning, Voltaire lived in tension, between wealth and poverty, obedience and rebellion, silence and speech. His father, a notary, hoped his son would follow law. But Voltaire, drawn to poetry and theatre, wandered early into letters, where thought could be sharp and language was a blade wrapped in velvet. He was witty, but not cruel. His humor was a balm and a provocation. When he wrote, it was as though he whispered something true in a room too polite to say it aloud. Early in life, he tasted the iron edge of power. In 1717, still in his 20s, he was imprisoned in the Bastille, that towering fortress of monarchy, for verses thought too bold. But even in confinement, he wrote. He reflected. He emerged from that cold place not silenced, but refined. Voltaire understood that the greatest resistance did not always wear armor. Sometimes it wore civility, a shrug, a sentence that sliced through hypocrisy with elegance. He traveled to England after further conflict with French officials, and there he found something that would shape him deeply. A society where thinkers debated openly, where philosophers walked the halls of Parliament, where tolerance was not mere idealism but fragile practice. He read Locke, Newton, and Bacon. He listened, he watched, and when he returned to France, he brought with him more than ideas. He brought a style of thought, curious, pointed, but always wrapped in calm logic. In his letters on the English, he praised their system, their science, their relative religious tolerance, their respect for individual rights. The book was banned and burned in France, but the words had already moved, quietly, through Europe. Voltaire was never safe from censure, but he learned how to move through power's blind spots. Using plays, fables, dialogues, and fiction, his most famous work, Candide, tells of a wide-eyed young man who travels the world, witnessing injustice, war, greed, and cruelty, all while being told again and again that this is the best of all possible worlds. It was a gentle, devastating satire. Not loud, not enraged, but devastating all the same. Through laughter, Voltaire exposed the absurdities of dogma, the failure of blind optimism, and the need for reason shaped by compassion. Yet he was not only a thinker, he was a doer. Quietly, steadily, when a Protestant man named Jean Calas was wrongly accused and executed, Voltaire worked tirelessly to clear his name, exposing religious intolerance and judicial failure. His campaign became a landmark moment in public advocacy, conducted not through marches or riots, but through letters, essays, and patient appeals to conscience. He wrote tirelessly, thousands of letters, essays, pamphlets. He engaged with kings and critics. He built a life of reflection, but never retreated from the world. Even as he aged, he remained alert, sharp, engaged. He once said, "I have only ever made one prayer to God, a very short one. O Lord, make my enemies ridiculous," and God granted it. But Voltaire's laughter was not shallow. Beneath it was grief, at injustice, at cruelty dressed as righteousness. He once wrote, "Those who can make you believe absurdities can make you commit atrocities." He wanted freedom of speech, not because he enjoyed provocation, but because he believed silence, when forced, becomes complicity. He lived for a time at Ferney, near the Swiss border, a self-imposed exile, where he created not just a home but a community. There he welcomed refugees, artists, and thinkers. He helped rebuild the local economy, supported farmers, and protected those persecuted for belief or background. Ferney became a symbol, a quiet republic of thought at the edge of a louder world. When he was old, near death, he returned to Paris. It was a triumphant visit, though he knew it could cost him peace. The crowds welcomed him like a returning star. He was too frail to stand long, but he smiled, and though he passed away soon after, in 1778, his presence lingered. He had whispered something the world could not forget. And what makes Voltaire so gently enduring is this: he showed that thought, even when silenced, can move like water, subtle, persistent, reshaping stone. That laughter can carry truth. That kindness, dressed in wit, may go further than thunder. He once wrote, "At the end of Candide, we must cultivate our garden." A simple sentence, but layered. To care for what we can, to root ourselves, to do what is possible, not dream what is perfect. That, too, is a kind of revolution, soft, soil-bound, and deeply human. So tonight, as you rest, think of Voltaire, not as a voice of fire, but of slow-burning light. Let his gentleness settle over your thoughts. Let his sentences, short, clean, curious, move across your mind like cool air. And remember, reason need not be loud. It only needs to endure. There are some lives that seem to wander through both forests and cities, through silence and storm. Lives that move like rivers, sometimes still, sometimes wild, but always flowing toward truth. The life of Jean-Jacques Rousseau was such a journey, shaped not by ease or acclaim, but by the soft, aching tension between society and solitude. He was born in 1712, in Geneva, a city of cobblestones and strict rhythms, into a world already in motion. His mother died just days after his birth. His father, once gentle, later disappeared from his life. Rousseau was left early on to the mercy of the world, which in turn taught him to listen inward. As a child, he was quiet, curious, prone to daydreaming. He read stories, walked long distances, and developed a deep love for nature. Not in theory, but in feeling, the sound of leaves, the glint of sunlight on a river, the solitude of a hillside. These were not metaphors to him, they were sanctuary. By his teens, Rousseau had left Geneva, wandering from city to town, working as a servant, an apprentice, a copyist. He lived not in palaces of thought, but among simple people, listening, watching, writing. His education was not linear, it was lived. And from that life emerged an idea, soft, persistent, that the human heart was naturally good. That it was not man who was flawed, but the structures that surrounded him. It was society, Rousseau believed, that distorted, confined, and corrupted the innate gentleness within us. This belief became the quiet drumbeat of all his work. In 1750, he published his Discourse on the Sciences and Arts, winning an essay contest with a provocative claim that the progress of civilization had not enlightened man, but shackled him. That reason, stripped from feeling, could become a tool of vanity, not virtue. His words stirred and unsettled. He was not writing in the manner of other Enlightenment thinkers, not with satire or calculation. His style was raw, confessional, even poetic. He wrote not to impress, but to express. His ideas came as personal truths, not abstract systems. In his Discourse on Inequality, he deepened the question: how had society transformed the free, natural person into a being driven by pride, competition, and dependence? He traced the evolution of property, class, and hierarchy, not as inevitable but as constructed, and beneath it all he mourned what was lost. But it was in the Social Contract, published in 1762, that Rousseau laid out his most enduring vision. Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains. He argued that true freedom was not the absence of law, but a system in which people governed themselves, not by kings or force, but by a shared general will. This will was not the loudest voice, but the truest one, the quiet convergence of what is best for all. For Rousseau, this was not utopia, it was responsibility. A society built not on dominance but on consent, not on vanity, but on virtue. At the same time, he wrote Émile, a work on education that followed the fictional life of a child raised in harmony with nature. Rousseau believed children should not be shaped to fit society's mold, but allowed to unfold, freely, gently, like plants in sunlight. The book was both revolutionary and tender. And yet, with each publication, Rousseau drew ire. His works were banned in France and Geneva. Warrants were issued. He fled from city to city, his once friend Voltaire among his critics. Misunderstood and increasingly isolated, Rousseau's life took on the shape of his ideas, at odds with the world, but inwardly sincere. He wrote autobiographical works late in life, Confessions, Reveries of the Solitary Walker, not to boast, but to reveal. His tone was aching, honest, sometimes defensive, but always human. He wanted the reader not to admire him, but to see him flawed, searching, alive. He walked the countryside often in these years, stopping to observe birds, clouds, the ripple of streams. He found more truth in the silence of nature than in the debates of salons. He believed that to return to oneself slowly, gently, was to begin again. Rousseau died in 1778, quietly, not long after Voltaire. They had shaped an age together, not as friends but as necessary contrasts. Reason and feeling, wit and confession, city and forest. And what makes Rousseau so calming, even now, is his faith in tenderness. He believed in the goodness beneath the noise, that behind every hardened face there is a soul longing to be free. That truth is not always spoken aloud. Sometimes it is walked or wept or whispered into the wind. He once wrote, "The world of reality has its limits. The world of imagination is boundless." So tonight, as you lie still, let Rousseau's quiet revolution echo within you, not as fire, but as dew. Let his belief in natural kindness soften your thoughts. Let his vision of freedom, gentle, shared, internal, carry you into sleep, not as escape, but as return. Return to the hillside. Return to your own quiet will, and let it rest there without chains. In the Prussian town of Königsberg, where cobbled streets led past quiet houses and the air held the chill of the Baltic Sea, there lived a man whose life was measured not in miles, but in thought. His days passed with gentle repetition, a morning walk, a midday lecture, an evening of reading beneath steady lamplight. And yet, within that rhythm, Immanuel Kant would build a towering cathedral of philosophy, not with bricks or bells, but with reason, duty, and light. Born in 1724, to a modest family of artisans, Kant lived nearly his entire life in that same city. He never traveled far, never sought fame, never stirred great scenes, and yet from his quiet desk, he redefined how we understand knowledge, morality, and time itself. Kant was not a man of early brilliance. His youth was spent in careful study, theology, science, mathematics. He worked as a tutor for years, walking long distances between households, shaping his habits and saving for a life of thinking. His temperament was gentle, his manner reserved, but his mind was crystalline, slow to ignite, yet steady once alight. In his early writings, Kant followed the prevailing thoughts of the time, but in 1781, at the age of 57, he published a book that would softly shift the foundations of modern philosophy, The Critique of Pure Reason. It was not easy reading. The sentences were long, the ideas complex, but within those pages Kant asked the most fundamental of questions: what can we truly know, and how do we come to know it? He argued that knowledge was not simply a reflection of the world outside, but a partnership between the mind and the world. We do not passively receive experience, we shape it. Our minds bring with them structures, space, time, and categories, like cause and effect, that gently filter and organize all we perceive. This was a quiet but radical idea. It meant that the world as we see it is always, in some way, a construction, not false, but formed by the lenses we carry. There is, Kant said, a difference between the phenomenal world, the world as we experience it, and the noumenal world, the thing in itself, which we can never truly grasp. But Kant did not stop at understanding. He turned to ethics, and there too he built a system both rigorous and tender. In his groundwork for the metaphysics of morals, he offered a vision of morality not grounded in emotion or consequence, but in duty, in the deep, quiet recognition that some actions are right, not because they bring pleasure or success, but because they honor reason and respect for others. At the heart of this vision was his idea of the categorical imperative. Act only according to that maxim, whereby you can, at the same time, will that it should become a universal law. It was not a commandment shouted from above. It was a mirror held inward. Kant believed that morality lived in consistency, in doing what we would wish all others to do, regardless of outcome. To lie, even for gain, was to fracture trust. To treat another as means only, not as ends, was to violate the sacred dignity within every human being. For Kant, freedom was not indulgence. It was the ability to act according to principle, to obey reason rather than desire. And in that obedience there was peace, not silence imposed, but silence chosen. He once wrote, "Two things fill the mind with ever new and increasing admiration and awe, the starry sky above me and the moral law within me." And that sentence, so often quoted, captures the softness of his genius. Kant saw that wonder does not need to be loud. It can reside in the quiet recognition that we are both tiny and luminous, governed by cosmic order, and yet capable of moral clarity. His later work, The Critique of Practical Reason and The Critique of Judgment, explored beauty, purpose, and the bridge between thought and feeling. He reflected on the sublime, the feeling of being overwhelmed by greatness, and saw in it a reminder of our double nature, humble yet capable of reverence. Kant's life remained peaceful. He never married. He rarely traveled. His days were orderly, almost monastic. He walked the same path every day at the same time, so reliably that neighbors would adjust their clocks by his passing. But inside that order was a boundless curiosity, a light that burned slowly but steadily. He died in 1804, surrounded by his books, his city, and his thoughts. His last words were said to be, "It is good." And perhaps that is the most calming aspect of Kant's legacy, the gentle belief that goodness is not something loud or distant. It is in the daily decision to act rightly, to think clearly, to treat others with dignity, even when no one is watching, especially then. So tonight, as you rest, think of Kant's quiet universe, where stars drift through space, and within you lives a compass just as eternal. You do not need to solve every question, but you can honor each moment. You can act with care, and that, he believed, was enough. In the darkness, let duty become not a burden, but a comfort. Let reason be your soft companion, and may the starry sky and the gentle law within guide you home. It was the end of a long London day, the kind where dusk settles in like soft linen, and the lamplight flickers through fog. In a small, humble room, a woman bent her head over parchment. The ink glistened briefly before it dried. Her pen moved not with anger, but with quiet resolve. She was writing not only for herself, but for every voice the world had taught to remain still. Her name was Mary Wollstonecraft, and her words, fragile yet forceful, would become the first deep whisper of modern feminism. She was born in 1759, into a home that grew increasingly unstable. Her father, once hopeful with inheritance, squandered it. The family moved often, tensions ran high. Mary witnessed the hardships of her mother and the quiet, enduring pain of women trapped by custom and dependence. From those early shadows emerged a voice unlike any other, not hardened by bitterness, but awakened by empathy. Mary understood that the world had drawn an invisible circle around women, silent, ornamental, and confined, and she believed gently but without compromise that this circle could be redrawn. Her education was irregular, often self-taught, but voracious. She read poetry, history, philosophy. She watched the world with unflinching clarity. For a time, she worked as a governess, a respectable post for a woman of ambition but limited means, and it was there that she began to shape her conviction that education, more than any force, was the root of true freedom. In 1792, her most enduring work was published, A Vindication of the Rights of Woman. Its title was clear, its tone calm, measured and unwavering. She did not demand superiority. She did not call for revolution in the streets. What she asked for was simple and yet radical, that women be treated as rational beings, that they be educated not merely in charm or obedience, but in virtue, reason, and self-respect. Wollstonecraft believed that to deny women education was not only unjust, it was unwise. A nation could not flourish if half its citizens were silenced. A home could not thrive if its daughters were taught to serve but not to think. She saw that women were not naturally inferior, but made so by their circumstances. She wrote, "I do not wish them to have power over men, but over themselves." Her sentences, often stitched with care, carried more than logic. They carried a deep tenderness for those whose potential had been stilled, for the young girls told to dream quietly, for the wives taught to endure, for the minds trained to yield rather than rise. But her life was no abstraction. Wollstonecraft lived what she wrote, not always easily and never without pain. She loved and lost. She believed in partnership, but often found loneliness. In a society that punished women for thinking freely, she was branded not as a philosopher, but as dangerous. Yet she wrote on, not for fame but for clarity. Her pen moved in service of truth, even when her voice trembled. She once traveled to revolutionary France, eager to witness a world being rebuilt. At first she was hopeful, but the violence that followed, the guillotine, the fear, the betrayals, left her disillusioned. She returned to England, not defeated, but wiser. She believed in reason, not rage. Later in life, she fell in love with the political philosopher William Godwin, a man who respected her mind and cherished her independence. They married, quietly, without fanfare. But tragedy followed close behind. In 1797, Mary gave birth to a daughter also named Mary, and within days she died from complications. Her final hours marked by suffering, her voice finally stilled. She was just 38. But her legacy had only just begun. Her daughter would grow up to write Frankenstein under the name Mary Shelley, becoming one of literature's most enduring figures, and Mary Wollstonecraft, though gone, would remain not as a symbol of rebellion, but as a soft beacon of reason. In the centuries that followed, her vindication was rediscovered. Slowly, gently, it spread. Readers came to see, not anger in her words, but balance. Not bitterness, but bravery. She had not fought to shout. She had written so that others might speak. And what makes Wollstonecraft so softly powerful is not that she was loud, but that she was clear. In a world where women's voices were backgrounded, she stepped forward not with fury, but with thought. Her truth was not noisy. It was firm. It did not fracture. It held. She taught that reason belongs to all, that dignity is not earned through birth or beauty, and that the quiet work of education, of becoming one's fullest self, is the deepest form of rebellion. So tonight, as your breathing slows and the world begins to blur at the edges, think of Mary, not on a podium but at her writing desk, candlelight flickering, her pen steady. She is not shouting. She is not demanding. She is simply, gently, telling the truth. And truth, whispered through silence, can move more than armies. Let her legacy wrap around your thoughts like a warm shawl. Let her clarity soften the noise of the day, and rest in the calm, knowing that the rights you cherish once began as a quiet sentence, written in ink, on a quiet night, by a woman who believed the world could be kinder if it only chose to see. In the quiet drawing rooms of Victorian England, beneath gas lamps and the rustle of newspapers, a young man sat often in silence, not out of shyness but deep reflection. His name was John Stuart Mill, and though his world was one of factories and empire, his thoughts moved slowly, deliberately toward something far gentler, the freedom of the individual soul. Born in 1806 in London, Mill was raised under the watchful, intellectual eye of his father, James Mill, a devoted follower of utilitarian philosopher Jeremy Bentham. From the age of 3, John was set on a path of intense learning. He read Greek by age 5, Latin soon after, and by adolescence he was immersed in logic, economics, and ethics. But this was not ordinary childhood. It was a childhood formed like sculpture cut to precise shape. And yet, even within that carefully measured upbringing, a tender heart grew. Mill's early life was shaped by the ideal of utility, the belief that the right action is the one that brings the greatest happiness to the greatest number. But as he matured, he felt something missing in that equation. Where he wondered was the space for beauty, for feeling, for conscience. He had been taught how to calculate happiness, but not how to feel it. At 20, Mill suffered what he later called a mental crisis. The pressure of perfection, of living as a machine of reason, had left him hollow. He questioned everything, even the value of the work he was born to carry forward. It was not anger that consumed him, but a deep, gentle sorrow. And it was during that quiet unraveling that something soft saved him, poetry, particularly the work of William Wordsworth. The verses did not offer answers, but they reminded Mill of emotion's quiet legitimacy. That truth to be whole must speak not only to the mind, but to the soul. From that point forward, Mill's philosophy changed. It did not abandon reason, but it welcomed feeling. He began to write not only for logic's sake, but for liberty. Liberty grounded not in dominance but in human dignity. In 1859 he published his most enduring work, On Liberty. It was a gentle, deliberate defense of the individual, of the right to think, to speak, to live one's truth, even when it ran counter to public opinion. Mill believed that a free society must not only tolerate difference, it must protect it, for only through open, respectful challenge could ideas grow. He wrote, "The worth of a state in the long run is the worth of the individuals composing it." In Mill's world, liberty was not lawlessness. It was the quiet right to explore conscience without fear. He believed that each person carried within them something sacred, a self, and to crush that self, whether by government, majority, or custom, was to violate something precious. But Mill did not see liberty as solitary. He was deeply concerned with justice, with equality, and with the unseen chains that still bound so many. He was among the first men of his time to argue publicly for women's rights, publishing The Subjection of Women in 1869. There, he made a simple and powerful point, that any society which denies equality to half its people cannot be truly free. His advocacy was not loud. It was patient, measured, spoken in halls and written in soft ink. But it carried the weight of truth, not shouted but trusted. Perhaps the most intimate influence on Mill's thought was Harriet Taylor, a woman of independent spirit and rare intelligence. Their relationship, over many years, and despite social disapproval, was one of profound intellectual partnership. She helped shape his thinking, not behind the scenes but beside him. Mill often said that much of what he became was due to her. When she died in 1858, he was devastated, yet even in grief, her voice lingered in his works, a presence of quiet reason and enduring warmth. In a world that often diminished women's thought, he elevated it, not out of charity, but recognition. Mill's later work, Utilitarianism, sought to balance his early teachings with his matured insight. He expanded the idea of happiness to include higher pleasures, the joys of thought, love, beauty, and conscience. He reminded readers that not all happiness is alike, and that quality matters as much as quantity. He believed in the slow shaping of society, through education, kindness, and dialogue. In Parliament, where he served for a brief time, he championed unpopular causes, not for gain but for justice, women's suffrage, labor rights, and freedom of expression. He died in 1873 in Avignon, France, where he had gone to be near Harriet's grave. His passing was gentle, his impact lasting. And what makes John Stuart Mill so soothing to reflect upon is the quiet balance he brought: reason with heart, liberty with care, thought with listening. He believed in the strength of minds that do not shout. He trusted in change that does not demand but persuades. He stood for conscience not as rebellion but as gentle persistence. So tonight, as the world slows and you drift toward rest, let Mill's calm reason wrap around you like evening mist. Let his words remind you that the self, yourself, is sacred, that liberty is not always loud, and that the quiet act of thinking for yourself is, in its way, a quiet revolution. Rest, knowing that even in a noisy world, thoughtfulness endures, that your mind is free, not to fight, but to reflect, and that, as Mill once believed, the soul of progress is not force, but understanding. Across the flat, wind-swept plains of 19th-century Russia, a man once wandered, neither hero nor prophet, but something in between. His boots were worn, his beard grayed with thought. His heart carried the weight of wars, novels, and restless searching. This was Leo Tolstoy, the nobleman who turned away from comfort, the soldier who became a seeker, and the novelist whose quiet words would echo across generations. Born in 1828 into an aristocratic family at Yasnaya Polyana, Tolstoy's early years were shaped by both privilege and profound loss. His mother died when he was 2. His father followed soon after. The estate where he was raised, filled with books, tutors, and silent forests, became not just a home but a mirror of contradiction, wealth paired with sorrow, education with longing. He tried law school, then left. He joined the army, seeking discipline, but found violence. He gambled, he drank, he wrote. Even in youth, his life moved between extremes, and always, somewhere beneath, a question pulsed quietly. What is the purpose of it all? In his early 30s, Tolstoy published 2 of the greatest novels the world has known, War and Peace and Anna Karenina. They were not just stories, they were vast tapestries of human life, stitched with war, love, politics, and spiritual hunger. But beneath the grandeur, what lingered most were the quiet moments: a soldier warming his hands by a fire, a woman pausing at a train station, a man remembering a field he once walked as a child. Tolstoy had an extraordinary gift for stillness. His prose, while grand in scope, never forgot the soul. He saw that the lives of generals and peasants moved to the same rhythm: birth, longing, joy, regret, and he wrote them all with the same reverence. But as his fame grew, so did his restlessness. Tolstoy was not content to be admired. He did not wish to remain a celebrated novelist. The questions that haunted his characters soon came to haunt him. What is goodness? Why do we suffer? What does it mean to live a moral life? In midlife, after the success of Anna Karenina, Tolstoy experienced a spiritual upheaval, not loud but deep. He looked at his wealth, his comfort, his literary reputation, and found it hollow. He feared death, yet feared more the idea of living without meaning. So he began to simplify. He gave up hunting, drinking, and meat. He rejected the Russian Orthodox Church for its ritual without compassion. He began to work the land beside peasants, dressing plainly, writing tracts on ethics and nonviolence. He no longer saw himself as a writer of fiction, but a voice for moral clarity. In books like The Kingdom of God is Within You, he called for a life of peace, humility, and self-reliance. a return to basic goodness, unclouded by institution or pride. He believed in nonviolent resistance long before the phrase became widespread. His writings would quietly influence minds like Mahatma Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr., and Nelson Mandela. Yet Tolstoy's transformation brought pain. His wife Sophia, once his closest partner, struggled to understand his rejection of property, family wealth, and even the copyrights to his books. Their love, once warm, cooled into distance. The home was filled with tension, not from cruelty, but from opposing truths. Still, he remained committed. His later writings became more spiritual, more stripped of narrative, and more focused on moral clarity. And yet, even here, his voice was not harsh. He urged simplicity, not as punishment, but as peace. He believed that to live gently, to consume little, harm none, and act justly was the highest form of human life. His journals reveal a man always reflecting, always seeking. He was not proud of his anger, his vanity, or his past, but he never stopped working inward. His spirit was a field constantly tilled. In 1910, at the age of 82, Tolstoy left his home in the middle of the night, quietly, with only a small bag and a notebook. He sought solitude, perhaps even anonymity, but his body, worn from years of searching, failed him. He collapsed at a small railway station, Ostapovo, where he was given a bed in the station master's house. There, in the hum of passing trains, surrounded by whispers and snow, he died. Not as a figure of fame, but as a man worn, complex, and searching to the last breath. And yet his legacy is not one of collapse, but of quiet strength. Tolstoy's life reminds us that greatness is not only in creation but in conscience, that the question, how should we live, may never be fully answered, but must still be asked gently, honestly, again and again. He once wrote, "Everyone thinks of changing the world, but no one thinks of changing himself." And in that sentence lives his softness. His challenge is not aggressive, it is internal. He invites you not to fight, but to examine, to look at the life you live, the things you seek, the peace you crave. So tonight, as you breathe into sleep, let Tolstoy's presence settle around you like evening snow. Let his field of questions quiet your own. You do not need to be perfect. You do not need to have answers. You only need to remain open to stillness, to truth, to the sacred work of simply being good. Let the noise fall away. Let the heart grow plain again. And let rest come, as it did to Tolstoy, slowly, gently, after a long and seeking life. In the soft gray streets of Copenhagen, where fog drifts through stone alleys and church bells echo through morning silence, a solitary figure once walked with slow, deliberate steps. His hands were often clasped behind his back, his hat tilted gently against the wind. He was not a priest, nor a poet, nor entirely a philosopher, and yet he moved through all of these roles like a shadowed lantern-bearer. This was Søren Kierkegaard, a man whose life was quiet, but whose thoughts carried storms. He was born in 1813 into a world of stern faith and intellectual depth. His father, a melancholic man shaped by guilt and scripture, left an indelible imprint on Søren's soul. The family was wealthy but withdrawn, haunted by loss. By the time Kierkegaard was a young man, most of his siblings had died, and his relationship with his father was tender but heavy. Kierkegaard grew into a deeply introspective young man, sensitive, witty, and fiercely intelligent. He studied theology and philosophy at the University of Copenhagen, but always with a restless heart. His journals from this time reveal a mind quietly on fire, a mind that asked not what do we know, but how should we live. His thoughts did not seek system or certainty. They circled around anxiety, dread, irony, and above all faith. Not the faith of dogma, but the faith that comes when reason fails, and the soul must still move forward. He called it the leap. Kierkegaard believed that life is filled with paradoxes, that to be human is to live in tension between body and soul, time and eternity, despair and hope. He saw that modern life, increasingly defined by comfort and conformity, had dulled the individual spirit. People, he wrote, were becoming reflections of one another, mirrors of expectation, losing their capacity to choose their own truth. And so much of Kierkegaard's work became a quiet plea to reclaim the self, to live authentically, even if that meant standing alone, to become not what society expects, but what one truly is. His writings were often unusual. He wrote under pseudonyms, each with its own voice and tone, as though truth could not be captured by a single identity. One persona might be passionate and romantic, another ironic and detached, but all moved toward a single center, the individual's journey toward meaning. In either or, he explored the contrast between the aesthetic life, ruled by pleasure and avoidance of suffering, and the ethical life, rooted in commitment and self-responsibility. The book is not a lecture, but a conversation, rich with letters, parables, and reflections. But Kierkegaard knew that even ethical life was not enough. There was another stage, more demanding, more silent, the religious life. To enter it, he believed, one must take a leap of faith, not because of certainty, but in spite of its absence. He wrote of Abraham, the biblical figure who prepared to sacrifice his son out of obedience to God. To Kierkegaard, Abraham represented the paradox of faith, that true belief often means holding two seemingly impossible truths, trusting the divine even when it seems unreasonable, and yet not surrendering one's responsibility. This kind of faith was not comfortable. It was trembling, raw, deeply personal. It required what he called fear and trembling, a reverence mixed with vulnerability. It was not a faith inherited, but chosen, quietly, again and again. Kierkegaard also spoke of despair, not as sadness, but as a condition of being disconnected from oneself. A person could succeed, smile, be admired, and yet be in despair if they were living falsely. True peace, he said, comes not from external success, but from becoming one's true self before God. But God, to Kierkegaard, was not distant. He was near, not in rituals, but in the whisper of the heart, not in answers, but in the act of listening. His personal life mirrored his writings. He once fell deeply in love with a young woman named Regine Olsen, and for a time they were engaged. But Kierkegaard, torn by his internal world and fear of burdening her with his path, broke it off. He never stopped loving her. She remained, in his writings, a symbol of both beauty and sacrifice, the cost of choosing a life of spiritual solitude. In later years, Kierkegaard's tone turned sharper. He criticized the Danish church, not out of hostility, but disappointment. He believed it had become hollow, more institution than faith. He called for a return to real Christianity, the kind lived in action, not comfort. He died in 1855, just 42 years old, from complications likely related to spinal disease and exhaustion. He had lived alone, written alone, and died largely misunderstood. And yet in time, his ideas began to ripple gently outward. His insistence on inwardness, choice, and truth would shape the birth of existentialism, influencing minds like Martin Heidegger, Jean-Paul Sartre, and Simone de Beauvoir. But more than influence, Kierkegaard offered something softer, a mirror, not to show the world, but to show the self. He once wrote, "To dare is to lose one's footing momentarily. Not to dare is to lose oneself." And that is where Kierkegaard's calm power lies. Not in declaring what is right, but in helping us see how often we hide. His voice, quiet, trembling, honest, reminds us that real faith is not the absence of doubt, it is the decision to walk forward anyway. So tonight, as sleep begins to gather, let Kierkegaard's presence be a gentle hush. Let his leap be your release, not into fear but into peace. You do not need all the answers, you only need the courage to be honest, to sit with your questions, and when the time comes to move, softly, inwardly toward truth, in faith, in silence, in the self that quietly waits to be found. In the shadowed silence of the Swiss Alps, a man once walked alone, not to escape the world, but to wrestle with it in solitude. With a small notebook in his pocket and the wind pressing against his coat, he walked for hours, tracing paths through pines and snow, his thoughts burning even as the world stood still. His name was Friedrich Nietzsche, and though he would be remembered for the sharp edges of his ideas, his soul was quieter than many ever knew, marked not by cruelty, but by pain, music, and a lifelong search for meaning through suffering. Born in 1844, in the small German town of Rücken, Nietzsche was the son of a Lutheran pastor. His father died when Nietzsche was just 5, and the boy was left to grow up in a household of women. His mother, his grandmother, his aunts, all loving, but woven into the fabric of a strict, pious world. He was a gifted child, bright, thoughtful, drawn to poetry and ancient languages. As a young man, he studied philology, the discipline of ancient texts and languages, and quickly rose to prominence, becoming a professor at the University of Basel before the age of 25. But academia would never hold him. Nietzsche's mind was never content with what had already been said. He wanted to ask what others feared to ask, to strip belief to its roots and see if anything remained. His health was fragile. He suffered from intense migraines, poor eyesight, digestive illness. Much of his life was spent in physical discomfort. And yet he walked. In mountain villages like Sils Maria, he wandered alone, notebooks in hand, each step unfolding an idea. His thoughts did not come in comfort, but in persistence, not shouted, but carved, like wind against stone. Though often mischaracterized in later times, Nietzsche was not a man of hate. He did not believe in dominance for its own sake, nor did he ever embrace cruelty. His philosophy was one of transformation, of enduring life's deepest suffering in order to become something higher, stronger, and freer. He wrote often of the individual not as a selfish figure but as one who must rise above conformity, mediocrity, and empty virtue. He challenged systems that dulled the human spirit, religion that asked for obedience without reflection, morality that punished excellence, ideologies that flattened the soul. One of his most misunderstood phrases, "God is dead," was not a celebration but a mourning. He was not mocking belief, but observing that traditional faith no longer guided people as it once had. And with that loss came a question: what now? In a world without inherited truths, where does one find meaning? Nietzsche's answer was not nihilism, but a new form of responsibility, the call to create one's own values, to live with such integrity that life itself becomes a work of art. He called this the path of the Übermensch, the overman, or beyond man. Not a tyrant, not a conqueror, but a person who dares to shape their own soul, not according to rules, but according to deep inner necessity. He believed that suffering was not something to be avoided, but transformed, not glorified, but endured with courage. For only through hardship, Nietzsche thought, does the self become strong enough to live without illusions. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, a poetic and often dreamlike work, he spoke through the voice of a prophet, one who descends from solitude to speak truth to the world. The language is lyrical, symbolic, full of fire and silence. In its pages are not arguments but visions, of eternal return, of joy, of the self that walks alone and still loves the world. And perhaps that was Nietzsche's deepest insight. Not that life is pain, but that even pain can be affirmed. He spoke of saying yes to existence, not because it is easy, but because it is ours. He wanted us to embrace life, not when it is kind, but even when it is cruel, to find within its difficulty a chance to create. He wrote, "He who has a why to live can bear almost anyhow." And this, more than anything, was his music. Nietzsche loved music, especially that of Richard Wagner, though their friendship later fractured. But in music, he heard something purer than logic, a sound that reached the soul before it reached the mind. It was rhythm, struggle, harmony, the same qualities he sought in philosophy. As his life progressed, his isolation deepened. His books were rarely read in his lifetime. His health worsened. His family misunderstood him. He was mocked, dismissed, and often feared. In 1889, in a public square in Turin, Nietzsche suffered a breakdown. Legend says he saw a horse being whipped, ran to it, embraced it, and collapsed in grief. Whatever truly happened, he never recovered. For the next decade, he lived in mental decline, cared for by his sister, his voice now stilled. He died in 1900, just as a new century dawned, one that would twist his ideas into shapes he never intended. Misused by ideologues, misquoted by tyrants, Nietzsche's subtle fire was often mistaken for brute flame. But tonight, here in this quiet space, we return to the real Nietzsche, the man who walked alone not to dominate, but to understand. The man who asked, with genuine care, what it means to live truly, bravely, and joyfully in the face of sorrow. His writing, sharp but never shallow, reminds us that the self is not something given, it is something made. That strength does not mean never falling, but rising again and again. That to affirm life, even in its uncertainty, is the rarest and most beautiful act of all. So as you breathe tonight, let Nietzsche's soft echo accompany you, not with command, but with quiet invitation. Become who you are, not what others expect, not what fear allows, but who your soul, in its quiet fire, longs to be. A soft light once glowed behind the shuttered windows of a small room in Vichy, France. A single candle, a desk, a quiet figure bent in thought. Her hands trembled slightly from hunger, her eyes shadowed by fatigue, but her mind was luminous. This was Simone Weil, a philosopher, mystic, and moral witness, who lived not to be admired, but to understand and to suffer beside the world's brokenness, rather than above it. Born in 1909, in Paris, Simone came into the world with brilliance already shaping her path. As a child, she was intensely serious, refusing luxury and choosing simplicity long before it was expected of her. Her family was Jewish, but not religious. Her intellect blossomed early, devouring literature, mathematics, and philosophy with quiet precision. At the École Normale Supérieure, among the most elite academic circles in France, she stood apart not just for her insight, but for her fierce independence. She refused privilege. She gave away her coat in winter. She shared her food with the poor. Her teachers called her the Martian, not out of ridicule, but because she seemed to live by a different gravity. But with genius was not in intellect alone. It was in her compassion, stretched to unbearable lengths. She could not separate thought from suffering. To understand the world, she believed, one must share its weight. In 1934, she took a leave from teaching and worked for a year in a factory. The hours were long, the machines loud. Her body broke beneath the labor, but she refused to leave. For the first time, the suffering she had studied became something she inhabited. Her writing from this time carries the quiet tremor of a soul learning humility through pain. Later, during the Spanish Civil War, she went to fight alongside anti-fascist forces, but her physical weakness made her more of an observer than a soldier. Still, she wrote, she watched, and she wept for every cruelty she saw. As Europe fell into the abyss of the Second World War, Weil's reflections deepened. She began to write with increasing clarity on affliction, attention, and the divine absence. For Weil, affliction was not simply suffering. It was a deeper spiritual wound, the kind that strips a person not only of joy, but of identity. And yet she believed that in the depths of affliction one could encounter something sacred, a void, a silence, where the soul is forced to surrender its pride and listen. In that silence, Weil believed, God waits, not as a rescuer, but as a presence too gentle to impose. Central to her vision was the idea of attention. Real attention, she said, was not a skill but a spiritual posture. To pay attention truly, fully, is to love. When we listen without ego, without interruption, when we look at another person without judgment or agenda, we participate in the divine. Attention, she wrote, is the rarest and purest form of generosity. Yet she never formally converted. She refused baptism. She believed that no institution should claim truth entirely. Her God was found not in ritual, but in silence, in the space between words, in the face of the hungry, the prisoner, the forgotten. During the war, she fled to the United States, then to England, where she worked briefly with the Free French resistance. But her health declined rapidly. She had long practiced fasting as a form of solidarity, and now, weakened by illness and malnutrition, she began to fade. Doctors urged her to eat. Friends pleaded, but she continued to refuse more than what was allotted to her fellow countrymen under German occupation. In her final notebook, her handwriting wavers, her lines grow shorter, and yet her clarity remains sharp, almost crystalline. She died in 1943, at the age of 34. Officially, the cause was tuberculosis, but those closest to her knew she had died from bearing too much of the world's weight. And yet her life was not one of despair. It was a kind of luminous grief, the kind that refuses to look away. Her legacy is not a theory, but to remain present in suffering, to hold attention like a candle in a storm, to love without needing to be seen. Simone Weil did not leave behind a grand system of thought. She left behind fragments, essays, letters, notebook entries. But within them lives a soul unafraid of affliction, unafraid of silence, unafraid of love that asks everything and gives no comfort in return. The extreme greatness of Christianity lies in the fact that it does not seek a supernatural remedy for suffering, but a supernatural use for it. As you close your eyes tonight, let that truth settle gently, that suffering, yours or the world's, is not meaningless, that even when no voice answers, your presence still matters, that the act of paying attention, soft, slow, silent, is a form of sacred resistance. In the quiet ache of your body, in the tremble of memory or hope. Simone Weil would say, "You are not alone. Even in absence, there is love. Even in silence, something eternal listens back." So sleep, not to escape the world, but to rest your soul for the morning's quiet mercy. There is a hush that falls over history when it turns to face conscience, not the loud conscience of war rooms or battlefields, but the quieter one, the one that sits in exile, behind thick-rimmed glasses, among piles of papers, trying to understand how the world in all its complexity can fall apart so easily. This was the world of Hannah Arendt. Born in 1906 in Linden, a quiet town in the German Empire, Hannah was raised in a cultured Jewish family shaped by literature and ideas. Her father died when she was still a child, but he left her with a fierce love of thinking, not just the act but the moral responsibility of it. From her earliest years, Arendt showed a deep seriousness. She read Kant in her teens, she questioned her teachers, and she entered university at a time when the field of philosophy was still almost entirely closed to women. But she pressed forward, not as a rebel, but as someone who simply refused to look away. In Marburg, she studied under Martin Heidegger, whose philosophy of being would influence her for years. Their relationship was complex, intellectually rich, emotionally charged, and ultimately troubled by Heidegger's later association with Nazism. Yet their early exchanges helped Arendt discover a core truth, that thinking is not a luxury, it is a necessity. She went on to complete her doctorate in philosophy in Heidelberg under Karl Jaspers, another mentor who would leave a lasting imprint on her soul. Her studies turned not toward abstract systems, but toward human dignity, responsibility, and the quiet question of what makes a life worth living. Then came the storm. When the Nazi regime rose to power, Arendt, as a Jew, a woman, and a free thinker, was suddenly endangered. She was arrested in 1933 for gathering evidence on anti-Semitic propaganda. Though released, she fled Germany soon after, first to France, and later to the United States. Exile, for her, was not just physical displacement. It was spiritual. It meant watching the world she loved collapse into cruelty, and knowing it had happened, not only through force, but through thoughtlessness. In the United States, she rebuilt her life in a new language. She began writing essays, reports, and political theory with a tone that was always calm, always deliberate. Her mind refused easy answers. Her writing was not ideological. It was attentive, watching how power moves, how evil operates, and how people one by one stop thinking. Her most famous work, The Origins of Totalitarianism, examined how modern tyranny rises, not just from terror, but from isolation, loneliness, and the erosion of truth. She saw that totalitarian systems create lies so massive that ordinary people stop asking questions. When citizens no longer think for themselves, power no longer needs to shout, it only needs to whisper. But perhaps the most haunting moment in Arendt's life came when she traveled to Jerusalem in 1961 to cover the trial of Adolf Eichmann, a Nazi officer who had helped orchestrate the Holocaust. What she found there was not a monster. Eichmann, she reported, was ordinary, polite, forgettable, disturbingly normal. He was not consumed by hatred. He was consumed by bureaucracy, by rules, by obedience. He had simply stopped thinking about the consequences of his actions. Arendt called this the banality of evil, a phrase that would echo across the world. Evil, she warned, is not always born from rage. Often it is born from neglect, from the refusal to ask, is this right? Her insight was met with both praise and controversy. Some misunderstood her words as a defense of Eichmann. They were not. They were a warning to all of us that the greatest crimes in history may be committed not by monsters, but by people who have forgotten to think. But Arendt was not only a chronicler of darkness. She also wrote about freedom, action, and the luminous space between thinking and doing. In The Human Condition, she explored how human beings leave their mark through speech, labor, and action, and how public life, when lived with integrity, becomes a kind of immortality. For Arendt, to live well was not only to be good, but to be awake, to be present in the world, not withdrawn from it. She believed that plurality, the coexistence of different perspectives, was the heart of democracy, and she called for a politics of truthfulness, where dialogue could flourish without domination. She never claimed to have final answers. In fact, she distrusted systems that offered certainty. Her writing always pointed back to the individual, and to the simple but difficult act of pausing, before obeying, before judging, before acting. In her later years, Arendt taught at universities across the United States, often surrounded by students who found in her not only wisdom, but a deep sense of ethical steadiness. She continued to write, slowly, carefully, until her death in 19. And now, when the world grows loud with slogans, when truth feels fragile, and when people attempted to follow rather than reflect, Arendt's voice returns, not as noise, but as silence that invites listening. She reminds us that thinking is not a luxury of the privileged. It is the foundation of freedom. She reminds us that evil is not always explosive. Sometimes it's just a checkbox, a nod, a failure to speak. And she reminds us that the world changes not through rage, but through attention to truth, to others, and to the consequences of our choices. So tonight, in this gentle space of rest, let Hannah Arendt's thoughtfulness surround you like soft rain. Let her steadiness calm your fears, and let her questions linger like quiet stars in the sky of your mind. What does it mean to think? What does it mean to act? And how can one life, even lived in exile, make the world more human? Sleep, not with answers, but with awareness. And in your stillness, let her legacy live on, somewhere beneath the surface of waking life. Beneath names, memories, routines, there moves a deeper current. It does not speak in words but in symbols. It does not follow the rules of time, but of meaning. And in that hidden river, one man waded quietly for decades, asking not what the world is, but what the soul truly longs for. His name was Carl Gustav Jung. Born in 1875 in Keswell, Switzerland, Jung grew up surrounded by forests, lakes and quiet rooms, filled with theological texts. His father was a pastor, gentle but melancholic, and Jung learned early to sit in silence, to listen to the stillness between things. But even as a child, he sensed that faith alone could not answer the questions that stirred beneath his skin. He dreamed, vividly, in colors and shadows and images he couldn't explain. These dreams, often strange and haunting, would follow him into adulthood, not as fears, but as messages, as if the self had layers yet to be explored. Jung trained in medicine, and then in psychiatry, eventually working under Eugen Bleuler at the Burghölzli Asylum in Zurich, where he treated patients with schizophrenia. But rather than seeing these patients as broken minds, Jung sensed they were trying in their own language to say something important. Not rational, not literal, but symbolic. It was this intuition that would guide his life. In 1907, Jung met Sigmund Freud, and the two formed an intense, almost father-son bond. Freud admired Jung's mind and hoped he would carry the torch of psychoanalysis forward. But Jung had his own path, gentler, more mystical, and far less tied to Freud's emphasis on childhood sexuality. Their split came slowly, painfully. Jung began to speak, not only of the personal unconscious, but of a collective unconscious, a deeper layer of the psyche shared by all humans, filled with archetypes, ancient patterns and symbols that appeared across cultures and times. To Jung, the mind was not a machine. It was a landscape, vast, mythic, sacred. He noticed that people across the world dreamed in similar symbols: the wise old man, the shadow, the mother, the child, the trickster. These were not inventions, he thought. They were the soul's language, whispering truths we'd forgotten, but still carried inside. Jung began to use dreams not as puzzles to solve, but as guides. He encouraged his patients and himself to listen, draw, write, and reflect. He called this process individuation, the lifelong journey of becoming whole by integrating every part of the self, even the parts we fear or ignore. Unlike many of his peers, Jung believed that spirituality was not a relic. It was essential. not in doctrine, but in experience. He read sacred texts from East and West, the Bible, the Tao Te Ching, the Upanishads. He studied alchemy, not as science, but as metaphor. The ancient dream of turning base matter into gold mirrored the soul's longing to transform suffering into wisdom. In 1913, Jung experienced what he called a creative illness. For years he withdrew from public life, turning inward with disturbing intensity. He recorded his dreams, visions, and inner dialogues in a work later known as the Red Book, a lush, hand-illustrated journal that read like scripture from the unconscious. In it he wandered through deserts, spoke to archetypal figures, and descended into the underworld of the self. He was not losing his mind. He was listening to it. And when he returned, his voice was quieter, but deeper. Jung's writings expanded, touching psychology, religion, mythology, art, science. He coined the terms introvert and extrovert, explored synchronicity, meaningful coincidences, and described personas, the social masks we wear. But always his aim was the same, to help people reconnect with what they had forgotten, not just mentally, but soulfully. He spoke often of the shadow, the parts of ourselves we reject or repress. He believed that ignoring the shadow leads to projection, when we blame others for what we refuse to see in ourselves. But by facing the shadow with courage, we reclaim our wholeness. Jung also encouraged encounters with the anima and animus, the feminine and masculine aspects within each person. He believed that true maturity comes when we balance these forces, neither denying nor dominating either. To Jung, healing was not the removal of pain. It was the integration of all that we are, light and dark, conscious and unconscious. He once said, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." And in this his work remains unlike any other. He built a home in Bollingdon, by the shore of Lake Zurich, a stone tower without electricity, filled with symbols carved into its walls. There, he would sit for hours, writing, drawing, listening to the rhythm of water and wind. The house was not just a retreat, it was a manifestation of his inner work, a place where time slowed and meaning deepened. Carl Jung lived until 1961, a witness to 2 world wars, the rise of modern science, and the dawn of the nuclear age. Yet his voice never hardened. It remained steady, introspective, and reverent. He did not offer easy answers. He offered mirrors, gently held, in which we might glimpse our forgotten depths. He believed that every person, no matter how lost, carried a spark of the self, the inner truth that calls us home. And he believed that the journey to that self was the greatest adventure of all. So tonight, let Jung's quiet presence guide you, not to escape your dreams, but to meet them. Let your sleep be not an absence, but a return, to symbols, to questions, to the whispering depth beneath waking life. The soul speaks softly. Carl Jung listened. Now, so can you. The waves broke gently along the Sausalito shore, where fog rolled across the water, like a soft curtain being drawn across the waking world. There, in a modest house that overlooked the San Francisco Bay, one man often sat on the deck, tea in hand, with a half-smile that held both wonder and mischief. He did not preach. He did not instruct. He simply asked you to listen, not with your ears, but with your spirit. His name was Alan Watts, and to many he became a bridge between East and West, thought and being, complexity and simplicity. But more than a philosopher, he was a reminder that life is not a problem to be solved, but a dance to be enjoyed. Watts was born in 1915, in Chislehurst, England, a quiet child raised by parents of both religious and curious minds. From a young age, he was drawn to the mystical, not in fear, but in fascination. The sound of church bells, the hush of old trees, the space between questions, all stirred something in him that would one day become the foundation of his life's work. He read deeply and widely. At just 15, he had already begun a lifelong conversation with Zen Buddhism, Taoism, and Hinduism. Unlike many of his peers, Watts didn't view these traditions as foreign, or exotic. He saw them as mirrors, different reflections of a single shared truth. In his early 20s, Watts moved to the United States. For a time, he became an Episcopal priest, hoping to reconcile his Christian upbringing with the non-dualism of the East. But institutional religion, with its structures and certainties, could not contain his spirit for long. He left the church, not in anger but in peace, carrying with him the conviction that truth cannot be owned, only explored. Watts became a lecturer, a writer, and above all, a storyteller of the soul. He had a unique gift. He could take ancient, often difficult teachings and speak them in a way that felt like sunlight breaking through fog. His voice, lilting, playful, unmistakable, became a companion to many, especially in the 1950s and 60s when Western minds began to look eastward for deeper meaning. But Watts was never a guru. He never claimed mastery. Instead, he guided with questions, with metaphors, with laughter. He often said, "Trying to define yourself is like trying to bite your own teeth." With this kind of wit, he invited listeners to loosen the grip of ego, to step back from the rigid self and into the wider mystery of existence. Central to Watts's vision was the concept of non-duality, the idea that life is not divided between self and other, mind and body, sacred and ordinary. In Taoism, he found language that mirrored this vision. The Tao is not a god, but the way of things, the rhythm that moves through all life, not to be controlled, but to be trusted. He described the universe not as a mechanism, but as a play, a divine game in which the self, in forgetting itself, experiences joy, loss, beauty, and rediscovery. In this view, suffering did not mean failure. It was part of the music. Just as a song is shaped by both notes and pauses, life is shaped by both form and emptiness. Watts did not deny pain. He simply reminded us that resisting it often deepens it. He said, "The more we struggle for life as pleasure, the more we are actually killing what we love." Through books like The Way of Zen, the book on the taboo against knowing who you are, and countless lectures and audio recordings, Watts helped untangle some of the most profound teachings from Vedanta, Zen, and Taoism, offering them not as dogma, but as gentle invitations. He spoke of ego not as an enemy, but as a useful fiction, a character in a play, valuable but incomplete. He taught that behind the illusion of separateness, there is only oneness. The wave may rise and fall, but it is never separate from the ocean. Watts also spoke about death, not with fear, but with curiosity. He believed that death is not the opposite of life, but the opposite of birth. That in returning to the void, we return to the source, to the dance itself. And most of all, he reminded people to come back to the present, not in forceful meditation, but in surrender. To laugh with life, not chase it. To be, not become. He loved good food, wine, poetry, and conversation. He was not austere. He was joyful and deeply human. He believed that the sacred was not confined to temples, but was present in every moment, if only we could be quiet enough to see it. He once said, "You are an aperture through which the universe is looking at and exploring itself." And in that one sentence he captured the mystery that many traditions spend lifetimes circling. Watts died in 1973, in his home by the bay, surrounded by books, water, and the soft stillness he had learned to call home. His voice, however, still lives in recordings that drift across streaming waves, in quiet quotes scrawled into journals, in the hearts of those who first heard his laugh and felt, for the first time, that maybe, just maybe, everything was okay. So tonight, as you settle into the silence, let Alan Watts be that calm, knowing presence beside you. He won't ask you to change. He won't ask you to strive. He'll simply remind you, with a smile, you are not a stranger here. You are not lost. You are the dance. You are the dream. And you've never been anything else. Just breathe, let go, and be.